Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holochak, philosopher, historian, Thomas Jefferson scholar. This is the first in a series of talks on Thomas Jefferson. The title of this series is the Sentimental Traveler Lectures. And the purpose here is to introduce you to a different aspect of Thomas Jefferson, one which you probably are not familiar with, Thomas Jefferson as a philosopher. As a philosopher, having studied Thomas Jefferson for a number of years, I find him to be a man of prodigious erudition and great depth of scholarship. So the first lecture that I have for you today will be titled Sentimental Travelers, Thomas Jefferson and the Reverend Laurence Sterne. Jefferson made no secret that Laurence Sterne was his favorite novelist and also his favorite moralist. Sterne was the author of two important novels, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, and A Sentimental Journey. To his nephew Peter Carr in 1787, he writes, "The writings of Sterne particularly form the best course of morality that ever was written." Now here note the superlative. He really did find in Sterne's novels great moral sentiments, moral life lessons. Much earlier in the 1771 letter to Robert Skipwith, he talks of the importance of finding moral lessons outside of history. He says, considering history as a moral exercise, her lessons would be too infrequent if confined to real life. That said, to Skipwith, he says that he finds fiction to be preferable to history in terms of the moral lessons that you find in works of fiction. History fails to excite in any high degree this sympathetic emotion of virtue, writes Jefferson. With respect to Sterne's Sentimental Journey, Jefferson says it doesn't even matter whether Sterne actually went to France or went to Italy. What matters is that we feel what he felt when he was writing what he wrote. Sterne's novels are substratally actually situation-sensitive moral guidebooks, and that's how Jefferson took them. Both Jefferson and Sterne held moral engagement in greatest regard. He castigated, Jefferson did, his daughter Maria in 1802 for her willingness, to withdraw from society, telling her that when he did so years earlier, withdrawal from society was its own punishment. What is a sentimental traveler for Sterne? Sentimental traveler, he says, is not idle, not inquisitive, not lying, not proud, not vain, not splenetic. A sentimental traveler is one governed by heart, not by the head. Writes Sterne, I seldom go to the place I set out for. I am governed by circumstances. I cannot govern them. Again, he writes, you take a withering twig and put it in the ground, and then you water it because you've planted it. So a sentimental traveler is a moralist first and foremost, and one fully engaged in the affairs of human beings. And I should add, perhaps, other living things. For Thomas Jefferson, he too talks of not governing, but being governed by circumstances, as did Laurence Sterne. He writes to General Andrew Jackson in 1823, a few years before his death, the motions of a traveler are always controlled by so many imperious circumstances that wishes and courtesies must yield to their sway. So life is a sentimental journey for both Sterne and Jefferson, and I have several key points. First, a sentimental traveler is one who lives with eyes fully open and eyes turned to all things, especially those things that escape the notice of everyday people. Writes Sterne, what a large volume of adventures may be grasped within this little span of life by him who interests his heart in everything, who having eyes to see what time and chance are perpetually holding out to him as he journeyeth on his way, misses nothing he can fairly lay his hands on. And again, the man who either disdains or fears to walk up a dark entry may be an excellent good man and fit for 100 things, but he will not do to make a good sentimental traveler. I count little of the many things I see pass at broad noonday in large and open streets. Nature is shy and hates to act before spectators, but in such an unobserved corner you sometimes see a single short scene of hers worth all the sentiments of a dozen French plays compounded together. Thomas Jefferson writes similarly. To John Page in 1786, he says, "It's unfortunate that most people think the occurrences passing daily under their eyes are either known to all the world or not worth being known. They therefore do not give them place in their letters." To the Marquis de Lafayette 1 year later, Jefferson writes of his peregrinations through France, "I'm constantly roving about to see what I have never seen before and shall never see again. In the great cities I go to see what travelers think alone worthy of being seen, but I make a job of it and generally gulp it all down in one day. On the other hand, I'm never satiated by the with rambling through the fields and farms, examining the culture and cultivators with a degree of curiosity which makes some take me for a fool, others to be much wiser than I am." Second point, as a sentimental traveler is someone who travels au pied de la veille, i.e. doesn't know, I set out for something, I really don't know where I'm going to wind up going. Nonetheless, a sentimental traveler strives for useful knowledge and real moral improvement. Writes Sterne, "I have a mortal aversion for returning back no wiser than I set out." Wisdom is Sterne's goal, and for Sterne, a sentimental traveler is a moral adventurer. Of course, Thomas Jefferson always talked about useful knowledge, and great evidence of that is in his University of Virginia, which was founded on elective education, and the curriculum was based on subjects that Jefferson deemed to be of extraordinary use for the students. Earlier, and I should say agriculture being the foremost subject, that Jefferson always considered to be that foremost subject. In his 1771 letter to Skipwith, he writes, "Everything is useful which contributes to fixing the principles and practices of virtue." Thirdly, a sentimental traveler is modest and humble. Sterne writes in his sentimental journey that he was feted and treated as a celebrity while he was in France. I quote, "At this price I could have eaten and drank and been merry all the days of my life at Paris, but 'twas a dishonest reckoning the gain of a slave." And so Sterne tells us that he took off for Italy the next day. Again, I quote from Sterne, "There is not a more perplexing affair in life to me than to set about telling anyone who I am, for there is scarcely anybody I can give a better account of than myself." Now we know that Jefferson considered humility to be a virtue. He held Jesus, especially from middle life on, in high esteem as the world's greatest moralist and moral reformer. And Jesus sanctioned a life of purest morality and a life of humility. Jefferson, too, practiced humility as president. He was no Triton among minnows, but a steward. He always considered himself to be a steward who was answerable to the people. Fourth, a sentimental traveler is self-controlled. Writes Sterne, "There is nothing unmixed in this world. Enjoyment itself was attended ever with a sigh." Again, man has a certain compass. The social and other calls have occasion by turns for every key in him. If he begins a note too high or too low, there must be a want either in the upper or under part to fill in the system of harmony. Jefferson writes to Madame de Tott in 1787 while in France, "The plan of my journey as well of my life being to take things by the smooth handle. Few occur which have not something tolerable to offer me." A fifth point, and this is an extraordinarily important point, is that a sentimental traveler, Sterne and Jefferson being examples, uses language with laxity, with fullness of imagination, in an effort to communicate the sentiments of the heart most completely. In other words, the moral sentiments. Writes Sterne, "There are certain combined looks of simple subtlety, where whim and sense and seriousness and nonsense are so blended that all of the languages of babel set loose together could not express them. They are communicated and caught so instantaneously, though you can scarce say which party is the infector." His novel, Tristram Shandy, gentlemen, is lambent. It is brilliantly playful. I would say almost irreverently lambent. The chapters are sometimes no more than a few paragraphs. Sometimes the chapters are no more than a few sentences, and he even has a couple of chapters that have no words at all. a chapter that features nothing. The chapters are anecdotal. If you're looking for a consistent storyline and a sort of stream of thought here, you're going to be disappointed. That was not Sterne's aim. He uses aposiopesis to full effect, that is the starting of a sentence and then leaving off without finishing it. I suspect the style that Sterne employs in his novels admits of a great deal of joie de vivre, joy of life. Now, Jefferson was an expert writer as well, especially in his letters. As an epistolizer, he chose to meet his correspondents on their terms. He wrote in such a way that he would bring himself to the level of the correspondent, either up or down, whatever it took. Writing for him, I think, was a joy. He practiced active and impassioned engagement with his correspondence. He took great liberties with grammatical conventions, oftentimes failed to capitalize the first word of a sentence. Beginning with a certain style, he would leave off the style in a mid-sentence for whatever reason. He believed language was alive, so he embraced neologism, new words, which were needed because of the rapidity of the scientific advances of his day. A sentimental traveler, here's a 6-point, has a sense of humor. Now, that is quite obvious if you read Sterne's works, which in Alf Mapp, the former deceased author, historian, talks of Sterne's lusty roast beef humor. And his writings certainly have a great deal of humor in it, stylistically and otherwise. The fact that Jefferson read Sterne, considered him the greatest moralist, and because Sterne was sometimes not so serious in his writing, shows that Jefferson, too, must have had a great sense of humor. I suspect, however, that his sense of humor was dry, intellectual, and fairly inaccessible to most people. In a letter to Maria Cosway in 1788, he talks of noses. He explains to her why he hasn't written her in a while. And the reference here is to a lengthy, playful digression concerning the length of noses, beginning in Volume 3, Chapter 31 in Tristram Shandy. Writes Jefferson, "At Strasbourg I sat down to write to you, but for my soul I could think of nothing at Strasbourg but the promontory of noses of Diego of Slaugenbergius, his historian, and the procession of the Strasburgers, to meet the man with the nose. Had I written to you from thence, it would have been a continuation of Sterne upon noses, and I knew that nature had not formed me for a continuator of Sterne, so I let it alone till I came here and received your angry letter." Finally, a sentimental traveler is a lover. I think Sterne's love affair of humanity is evident in both of his novels, as well as his sermons. He had a great love of people, and his characters, the heroes of his works, are full of love. So that needs no amplification. Now, Jefferson, prior to the death of his wife on September 6, 1782, copied the following passage. The first part appears presumed in the handwriting of his deceased wife, and the second part in Jefferson's own hand. It's from Sterne's Tristram Shandy. It goes as follows. "Time wastes too fast. Every letter I trace tells me with what rapidity life follows my pen. The days and hours of it are flying over our heads like light clouds of windy day never to return. More everything presses on, and every time I kiss thy hand to bid adieu, every absence which follows it are preludes to that eternal separation which we are shortly to make." The passage taken from Tristram Shandy is indicative and expressive of Sterne's great capacity for love, the love of life and love of other people. The fact that Jefferson appropriated the passage shows Jefferson, too, had a great love of Sterne, love of people, and love of life. I wish to close by reference to a very highly neglected aspect of Sterne. That is his sermons, the sermons of Mr. York, which are 45 in total, Jefferson read these and recommended them to select correspondents. Robert Skipwith in 1771, we've already seen that letter, to Senator Joseph C. Cabell, a person who was extraordinarily important for helping Jefferson get the University of Virginia off the ground in the letter to 1800, and to General John Minor in 1814. What can we draw from that? Well, Jefferson, a deeply religious man, devoutly religious man in his own way, looked for moral lessons anywhere he could find them, whether he found them in esteemed sermonizers, whether in works of fiction, whether in works of history, whether in formal ethical works, whether in real life. So both were, he was a highly moral person, and fully engaged in the affairs of other people, in affairs of the cosmos, it might even be said. So Jefferson and Sterne, it seems to me, were sentimental travelers. If you're interested in learning more about Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher, I direct you to my website, www.thomasjeffersonphilosopher, one word, thomasjeffersonphilosopher.com. There you can pick up a copy of my recent book, Thomas Jefferson, Uncovering His Unique Philosophy and Vision, where I talk about Jefferson's cosmos, Jefferson's ethical views, Jefferson's political philosophy, Jefferson's philosophy of education. You can also learn a bit more about me and have access to a large number of very short essays on Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher. Thank you.